I believe our DNA is set up for feast famine. The
Right.
problem is today we're stuck in feast. We know now that feast famine, it resets our DNA. What I mean by that is it turns off genes that get turned on, whether it's obesity genes, diabetes, thyroid, bad genes. We have these times of famine where we can reset that DNA, and it resets our microbiome.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining us for another webinar. Super excited to have an amazing guest today. We're going to be talking about fasting, hormone optimization, autophagy, and a lot of these very, very hot topics right now that are gaining a ton of momentum when it comes to research and the science around them. Our guest today is the esteemed Dr. Daniel Pompa. Dr. Pompa received his Bachelor of Science from the University of Pittsburgh before doing his Doctor of Chiropractic degree at Life University. His authority today, however, is not necessarily rooted in his academia, but rather his own experience in battling and overcoming a serious neurotoxic illness and heavy metal poisoning using the cellular detoxification strategies that he learned and developed in his journey back to health. And a lot of that we're going to be talking about today. So, Dr. Pompa, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Why don't we jump right into hearing a little bit more about your story, because I think it really sets the foundation of why you're so passionate about what you do and why you've reached so many thousands of people with your message and the strategies that you've been teaching people over the years.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me. I was blessed to speak at this huge leadership conference in Africa, and I was nervous. I had an interpreter, and there's world leaders from all around Africa, and I stepped off stage, and this one gentleman who was a major leader in Zimbabwe, he beelined towards me, and I'm thinking, oh gosh, I don't know what I said. They were interpreting. He said to me, Dr. Pompa, your authority does not come from your years of academia and your learning, but it comes from the victory God gave you. And when he said that, I really didn't think much of it, but now I can tell you that everything I learn and teach, and I'm blessed to teach doctors all over the world, cellular healing and cellular detox. That's what I do in my fasting strategies. But it came out of all of that, from pain to purpose. I was really sick, and I didn't know what was wrong for many years. It started with fatigue, and then it went to insomnia, panic attacks, every hormone-related condition. I was downstream trying to get my adrenals right, my thyroid, my hair was thinning. I mean, all these things, my life fell apart, literally. I mean, I really couldn't work. I had to tell my business partner what was going on at one point because I became non-functional, really. And the bad part was I didn't know what was wrong for many years. And I thought I literally, before it hit, I was in the best shape of my life. And I thought I was just overtraining, but it went from fatigue to all of these other symptoms. And one day I found Mad Hatter's disease online. And I don't know if you know what that is, but they were using mercury to make felt hats, and they became acutely mercury poisoned. And I thought that was it. So I ran a blood test, but it wasn't it. It was a year or more later, I was working with a very bright endocrinologist, became friends with him, read all his books. And he said, I think you have mercury poisoning, Dan. I said, I thought so too. But I ran this test negative. He said, wrong test. That'd be if you had acute mercury poisoning like the Mad Hatters. But I think you have chronic. Anyways, it led to he was right. And so I spent a lot of years trying to figure out how to get it out of my brain, because that actually was where it accumulated. I ended up asking, what do you think I got? He said, do you have any dental work done around the time this all happened? And sure enough, I did. I had 2 silver fillings removed, which they contained 50% mercury. And it happened days after that, but I never correlated it. And looking back, I mean, I was building it up my whole life. The number one source of mercury and lead is mom, believe it or not. So the number of fillings mom has, it's called there was a study called the giraffe study. It's proportional to how much mercury we find in the baby's brain. And that's on autopsy, so very accurate. And lead's the same way. Lead is stored in the mom's bones, and during pregnancy, it comes out and ends up in utero. But then I had other exposures along the way, from vaccines to, I wore contact lenses in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. This thimerosal, that's the mercury compound, it was in the saline solution. So I was putting mercury in my brain that way, plus my fillings. And eventually my bucket overflowed, honestly, and that's when I got sick.
Wow. How old were you when this all happened and you
Yeah,
eventually
I mean,
discovered?
I look back, that was 1999. So, I mean, I was in my 30s, just early 30s, and here I am in my 50s now, healthier than even when I was in my
Wow.
20s, I can assure you.
Yeah, what a journey. You made a really good point there that the accumulation is often the issue that results in not necessarily one key insult, but multiple insults over time. And then all of a sudden you have this issue that arises and you start to have the symptoms and you have to work backwards. So,
Yeah,
okay. Well, that's obviously one heck of a journey that you had to go through to get to this point.
yeah.
What you're doing seems to have worked, which is fantastic. And I can see again why you're so passionate about wanting to share all this. So why don't we jump right into it? Instead of going first to the foundations and kind of getting to know some of the basics to make sure, let's talk about what is hormone optimization and why is this something that we need to understand as both practitioners and patients?
It's a great question because, the older we get, the more important this becomes. And I should say
Yeah.
the sicker we become, the more important this is. When you look at, when I was sick, right, I was completely hormone upside down. Now, I was spending time trying to fix my adrenals, my thyroid hormone, and all my hormones. And, I realized at one point the problem was in the pituitary hypothalamus. That is what controls
Mhm.
your thyroid, your adrenals, most of your endocrine system. That's your hormone system. But I couldn't figure out what was going on, and it wasn't until years later that when I realized I had mercury toxicity, that I realized that it bioaccumulates in the pituitary hypothalamus. So it disrupts your whole hormone system. And then here's the other problem. It makes its way in and around every cell in your body. Your hormone
Mhm.
receptors are on the cells. So what happens is the toxins come and they make their way to these fatty membranes. They blunt those hormone receptors. So it doesn't matter what your hormones look like in blood, because here was the frustrating point, Dr. Alex. I was looking at my blood work. I couldn't find anything wrong. Doctors started looking at me like I was just nuts. Matter of fact, after a while, they started offering you psychotropic drugs, because you look crazy. I felt crazy,
Mhm.
frankly. But I wanted to find something wrong, and my blood work was normal. Even my thyroid blood work. I was out of optimal range, but I was still in this normal broad range. In my adrenal, I was doing cortisol testing, and it was a little off, but not how I felt. So I knew the problem was here, and I knew the problem. I figured out later the problem was these toxins were blunting the receptors to the hormones. So the point is it didn't matter what the hormones out here were doing. That looked normal in blood. They weren't getting their message in the cell. So I didn't feel well, right? And
Mhm.
so ultimately, I mean, how I got my life back was cellular detox, which took me years to learn. I say it now like it was so easy, but real detox has to be at the cell, because that's where the hormones communicate, and that's how you feel well. That's how your hormones function well, is how well your cells are functioning. But when toxins drive that inflammation, you don't feel well. So to answer your question, why is this important? Most people have brain fog, digestive issues, hormone dysregulation to some degree, just not thriving. They start losing muscle, gaining fat. And we think that's normal with aging. Well, I can tell you, I'm in my mid 50s. I'm leaner and more fit today than I was, honestly, in my 30s. And I can tell you that that's a possibility for everybody, but you do have to optimize your hormones. And that means you have to optimize the function of your cells. That means you have to detox your cell to get well. And that's a saying. I say you have to fix the cell to get well. More specifically, you have to detox the cell to get well. So very important, this hormone optimization. And that's detox, yes, but a lot of my dietary strategies, fasting strategies is another way that we optimize hormones, not just in sick people, but athletes, people that just want to feel well.
hmm Gosh, I love that summary they just gave, and particularly highlighting the fact that when you do certain functional testing, that it may not actually reveal what the issue is. And so
Right.
we have this broad spectrum of functional tests now that we can apply. But if you're not looking down at the cellular level, and why we're often also looking at the mitochondria now when it comes to longevity and fasting especially, you're missing the big picture. In fact,
Right.
you're missing the small picture, and it's the big picture that you're not going to be able to solve at the end of the day. So it's a really great point. We're going to dive more into that. And I really want our listeners to understand what it means to detox the cell specifically versus just kind of the system
Yeah.
overall. But before we get into that, let's take a step back here, because fasting is a big part of your overall program and
Yeah.
big part of what you typically educate people on. And usually a lot of fasting has to do with removing carbs. So are carbs bad overall? Because this has become
No.
quite a contentious issue, right? So we should
No,
maybe
as a
start
matter of
there.
fact,
Yeah.
carbs are a strategy to my hormone optimization, honestly. So a lot of people, I think today in our world, right? I think people that are trying to get healthy or are healthy, carbs become a bad word, and that's why you asked the question. And so we
Hmm.
stick to very low carb diets, ketosis, paleo, go down the list, right? Um, but what I found was that you actually can affect your hormones in a negative way. Whereas in the beginning, the diet works very well. But here's what happens hormonally. The body's so smart, it wants to basically stay alive. It's survival is its number one priority, right? So what it does is when you go into these low carb states, it basically your cells are using maybe 95% of its energy it's getting from fat, your own fat stores, fat you eat, etc. So, which is great. I mean, it's a very healthy place to be. However, when you're there long enough, the body says, okay, this fat is my only fuel, so I want to start conserving it. So, guess what it does? It
Hmm.
starts blunting your hormone receptors that are involved in fat storage and fat burning. And so you start to notice that you start gaining a little more belly fat and you start losing muscle. Joe Mercola, I saw him at a seminar, was in Orlando, and he said, Dan, no one's more strict than me. And I can tell you, is there an answer for why I feel like I'm losing muscle, I'm getting weaker in the gym, and I'm putting on some belly fat? I said, same thing happened to me. I said,
Hmm.
here's what's happening. And I explained why the body, when it is burning mostly fat, it wants to hold on to it because it wants to survive ultimately. The best example I can give you is this. If you're in the middle of the woods in a cabin in Alaska, in the harshest winter of your life, you have a wood pile that normally lasts you through the winter, but this winter is way harder, way colder, much longer. You're running out of wood. Are you going to burn less or are you going to burn more? You're going to burn a lot less. So instead of being at 70 degrees, you're going to bring it down to 50, burning less wood. That's your metabolism getting lower and lower, afraid to burn its only fuel supply, right?
Right. Yeah.
And then someone comes over, he's a good friend of yours, and he sees that you're out of wood, and he says, I have plenty. And he dumps you a whole new load of wood. Are you going to burn more or less? You're going to immediately fire it up again, right? The fat burning machine,
Hmm.
and you're going to
Yep.
start burning more, bring up that metabolism again. That's exactly what happens when periodically we throw these carb days. So carbs are not the enemy. Carbs can
Hmm.
manipulate and drive a hormone optimization. Now your body goes, let's burn it freely. We're not dying. We're not in survival mode. So we do that. We have strategies weekly. We have strategies monthly. And I call that diet variation or feast famine cycling.
Okay. Yeah. This is a big topic that I actually bring up with patients a lot, because people are always looking for the next weight loss solution. And when previously you were saying about, optimizing your hormones to improve leanness, overall body leanness, and the fact now that you're saying that carbs are actually a component of that in stabilizing. When you look to areas like blue zones, where you have some of the healthiest populations and they're actually consuming 50 to 60% carbohydrates in general, it kind of makes you question, okay, these people are very healthy, but they are maintaining still carbohydrates in their diet on a regular basis. Very much reinforces what you're saying, that carbs are not bad. They're a tool used in a certain way, and removing them is a tool as well.
But look, Dr. Alex, when you look at ancient cultures, I love reading literature, I love reading studies. I'm good at it and I enjoy it. However, I've probably learned more from ancient cultures, and I've had the privilege of being in Africa
Hmm.
a few times and spending time with one of the last hunting gathering tribes, and I learned a lot, frankly, some things that changed my whole perspective. But when you look at people in this country, they line up on specific diets: paleo, keto, vegan, vegetarian. But when you look back in history and ancient cultures, they were in and out of different diets. They were at certain times, the Hunza people, they thought that they were vegetarians. And then if you visit them in the winter, which nobody wanted to, they ate a massively high fat diet with no carbs. And then spring, it was known as fasting spring. They ran out of food. They were a time of famine. I believe our DNA is set up for feast famine. The problem is today we're stuck in feast. We know now that feast famine, it resets our DNA. What I mean by that is it turns off genes that get turned on, whether it's obesity genes, diabetes, thyroid, bad genes. We have these times of famine where we can reset that DNA, and it resets our microbiome. So we know now that our microbiome shifts with these dietary changes. So my strategy of diet variation applies seasonally as well, mimicking these ancient cultures. And here's the thing. This is the example I think everyone can understand. If you go to the gym and do the same thing all the time, not only do your results plateau, they actually taper down to where you're not getting results at all. You actually start getting worse and you wonder what's going on. Well, a good trainer comes in and what does he do? He starts changing your diet, to my point, but he starts changing your exercise, and all of a sudden now you're starting getting results again. Was it the TRX or was it this machine, that machine? No, it's the change. The change forces the body to adapt. Okay, and how does it adapt? It adapts by hormonally optimizing. It raises up growth hormone to adapt. Your cells become more sensitive to the hormones to adapt. Norepinephrine, basically anti-inflames you, rises up when you change your exercise. The same thing happens with dietary change. When we change our diet, like they do in these ancient cultures, we hormonally optimize because our body's adapting via microbiome, the cells are getting more hormone sensitive, growth hormone spikes, all of it. And, hot cold's the same way. It's becoming really popular to go into cold and hot. And, I have studies on my workbench here showing that to break through weight loss resistance, you can put mice, rats, humans in hot, cold, and we can break through. Why? Well, they noticed two things. Number one, the microbiome shifts, which creates a hormone optimization. Number two, surges in growth hormone, norepinephrine, which breaks through weight loss resistance. Why? Adaptation. It's adapting. The body goes into cold, it thinks it's going to die, it hormonally optimizes. Dietary shift, exercise, hot, cold, all the same. So what we've done in my doctors that I train is we apply these principles to optimize hormones seasonally. We do it even monthly. Let me give you an example. A week before, we learned this the hard way or the good way, I don't know. But a week before a woman's cycle, and men, this is men's health. This goes for optimizing testosterone for men too. You pick 5 days a month and you go high carb. And then you pick another 5 days and you either fast, either partial fast, or maybe it's a pure water fast. So high carb, that represented 5 days of feast, and then pick a 5-day famine. Water fast for 5 days, partial fast. You do that monthly. Watch what happens hormonally. Magic. Yeah. And then weekly, throw in one or 2 days of these feast days. Saturday, I feast, either high protein or high carb. And then today, I eat one meal. I fast all day until dinner. I did the same thing the other day as well. So feast famine weekly, feast famine monthly, and seasonal changes. It works.
Yes, and I really try to avoid being an echo chamber, but I have to say, when it comes to this, I am so 100% on the same page. When you look at the literature and you look back in time, there is no one diet that was consistently followed all the time, nor lifestyle. Things constantly changed, and food was constantly available or unavailable. You would catch an animal, you would eat the entire animal for the next week, and then you would have no food for the next week. So to apply a consistent diet every single day the same way and the same kinds of routine and exercise, I completely agree. And that's, again, when you look to areas like the blue zones, you can see that much of their therapeutic effects were the fact they went through famines at certain times and their bodies had to adapt to that. And they will eat seasonally, meaning that things tend to shift. You mentioned the Hunza population or the Inuit up here in Canada, same thing. Their foods change throughout the year. So really, really love how you summarize that up. That's fantastic. I think we need to maybe just clarify what the difference is between fat burning and sugar burning and why that becomes so important with regards to hormone optimization, but also the cautions around being long-term low carb. Why you might caution against that?
Yeah, great question. I mean, your cells only use two things for energy, sugar or fat, right?
Hmm.
So when we go really low carb, we're forcing our cells, as I mentioned earlier, to basically use fat as its major energy source, right? So if glucose is available, it'll burn that first and foremost because it's so damaging. It's oxidative, right? And that doesn't make it
Hmm.
bad. The body uses it. It's a fuel source, but it intuitively will burn that up first. So sugar or fat. And when we go low carb, we can force ourselves to use fat. And as I pointed out, if we stay low carb long enough, our body will start to want to hold on to that only fuel source. That was the
Right.
example I gave, the wood in the, in the middle of the woods, is you'll burn less and less. Therefore, your metabolism is going lower and lower. That's why Joe is losing muscle, because it literally, through a process called gluconeogenesis, it will break
Hmm.
muscle down eventually into sugar. That's why I was getting weaker in the gym and
Hmm.
losing muscle. Listen, bodybuilders knew this years ago, right? I mean, they would do these feast days, to stimulate the carb. And then for a competition, they would lean down. But if they went too low carb without throwing in feast days, they would eat their muscle. So
Right.
that's why this feast famine works. I interviewed Kristen Verde. She's on a lot of the different studies, and she showed in some of her studies that feast famine worked better than low fat, worked better than low carb, where like these constant diets. And I asked her the obvious question, why is that? And she said, adaptation. When you do this feast famine, you're just forcing the body to adapt, and it creates a hormone optimization via adapt. So staying in one diet, I would argue, staying in a vegan diet too long is not good. You can create certain deficiencies, but I would argue the same for a paleo. I would argue the same for ketosis, is these diets get in vogue. And here's why people stay in them, Alex, is because when people shift over to a vegan, vegetarian, keto, again, down the road, they feel better, right? Because it has
Hmm.
benefits, right? All those diets have major benefits, but then they just stay there because we have the ability to stay there,
Right.
missing the benefit of forcing our cells and our body to adapt. So we don't want to stay in diets. There's mistakes there. We need to hormonally optimize by changing diet.
And can you just reinforce again, specifically for men's health and testosterone, like you were touching on before, when you are on a consistent low carb diet, what exactly is happening to testosterone?
Yeah, no. So what happens is that eventually your body will do everything it can to start burning muscle and use it as a source. So guess what? Your cells become more deaf, if you will, to testosterone and growth
Right.
hormone. So it's not a good place to be. Where the opposite is true. The moment you start doing diet shifts, or throw in these carb days, your cells start hearing testosterone again. So
Right.
here's the mistake. It's not. I think it's in vogue right now to take hormones, right? I mean, bioidentical hormones, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. There's a time and a place. So I'm not speaking against taking hormones. There is a time and place. However, the analogy is this: you shout at your kids, there's a time and a place. But the more you shout at them, the less they hear you. Trust me, I have some experience here, okay?
Yeah.
So the more you shout at them, the less they hear you. And that's what's happening with our cells. Everybody's taking hormones in the cells, the receptors are on the cells, they get more and more blunted. So
Mm.
ultimately, we have to understand, how can we get our cells to hear hormones better? Number one, you have to detox the cell to get well, because the toxins drive inflammation and blunt the receptors. Number two, dietary shifts, as I'm explaining, drives this sensitivity. One of the ways that we adapt hormonally is the cells become more sensitive. And so it's all of a sudden getting our kids to hear us like with the finest whisper. So it's not
Hmm.
about gaining more hormones. All of a sudden your testosterone, you're at 400-500, which isn't considerably that high. Free testosterone, normal level, maybe low normal, and you're thriving, lean and plenty of muscle. See, it wasn't about driving the hormone up, because your cells will just hear it less when it shouts louder. But it's getting the cell to hear the hormone you have. When you look at very healthy people, they don't have super high hormones. Their cells are sensitive to the hormone. So
Right.
when you stay in these dietary shifts, your cells get less and less hearing the hormone.
Yeah. Yeah. And we obviously hear this a lot with insulin resistance, right? That's probably the most common type of effect that we see in this way that leads eventually to diabetes. But we don't talk really about general hormones in that regard, and
Right.
especially steroidogenic hormones like this. So great point. Love again that kind of circling back to the fact. Yep.
You know, when I started, it's funny you brought that up, the insulin, because that's kind of one of the things that led me on to that, because I was wondering why I was in ketosis, and it worked very well for me for a lot of for a period of time, and then I started losing the muscle, right? And I noticed it. I started getting belly fat. You know, when you're lean, you notice that right away. So what did I do? I started lowering my carbs even more. I was down to 30. Then it was 20, 10. There was days where I was eating 0 carbs. I was getting worse. And not only that, I was getting this cellulite looking fat. It was um, I don't know how to describe it except cellulite. Well, I found out the reason why. Number one, to hold on to fat, your body will put water in fat cells to slow down fat metabolism, and you get this dimply, like loose fat. It was happening in my belly. Absolutely not pretty at all. And then I started researching, and I found that low carb diets cause insulin resistance. Now I'm thinking, wait a minute, that's impossible. We use low carb diets to help insulin resistance, right? Meaning the cells can't hear insulin, right? Type 2 diabetes. But what I found was it doesn't cause it in a way like the disease. It does it in that survival way. The DNA of your cell will send a signal to the insulin receptor on the cell, and it blunts the receptor so you can't hear hormone. Why? The hormone insulin. Because the hormone insulin is a fat storing hormone. So by doing that, blunting the receptor, you start storing fat. It's surviving. It's all it's doing. So the moment I started throwing in some high carb days, magic. The blunting stopped. The body backed off and said, okay, we can stop blunting the insulin receptor. So anyways, yeah. So I mean, hormonally, you can blunt these receptors. And I believe it goes even beyond insulin to testosterone and other anabolic hormones.
Of course, exactly. It highlights again how important it is to maintain a balanced diet. And we saw back in the 90s and early 2000s similar effects where people were eating very low fat diets. Now it's shifted to low carb diets. It doesn't really matter what it is. If it's low anything for too long, you're going to start running into these problems.
The variation is the magic, and yet people won't hear it because they're dogmatic about their camp. I mean, Low Carb USA, they haven't invited me back since I gave this message. Because that was that. I haven't been back since.
So again, that's why I love that we're talking about this, because at the end of the day, one type of dogmatic approach is often very easy for people to implement, and then they say, I'm getting effects with that, and therefore I want to stay on that. But at the end of the day, we have to be able to share the message as well, that there's the variability, and we can take multiples of these diets and just put them together or follow the kinds of plans that you are suggesting people do. But we'll get there. While we're on this topic, because it's becoming such a very key component to the overall fasting discussion, I wanted us to touch on autophagy and what that exactly means and why it's so beneficial to our overall health, but also specifically our cells. Can you touch on that a little bit?
I love this topic. The 2016 Nobel Prize was won by a Japanese gentleman who basically made this term more popular. Autophagy, is one way of saying it. I think I said or autophagy is the way it's been popularized now. Autophagy is the way I started saying it, and then it came to, we say it autophagy. But, really what it means is that in a very low caloric state or a fasting state, period, just water, the body to survive will eat its bad cells for nutrition, for water, every need it has. It's so smart that it doesn't take your good ones. It doesn't take your good muscle. It doesn't take your good liver cells. It takes the bad ones, the ones that have lived too long, that are causing inflammation, mischief, whatever you want to look at it, but or the bad DNA. It literally will eat those and get the proteins it needs, the water that it needs. That's called autophagy. Now, here's the best part about it. Number one, our bodies are meant to go through this. It's a renewal process. And I made the point earlier that, we're not doing these feast famine cycles, right? We're always in a feast stage. Well, it's in these famine states that this autophagy happens, and we clean house, literally. But here's the best part. The body just doesn't take away bad cells. Every time it takes away a bad cell, it stimulates a stem cell, and it recreates a new one. So, I studied fasting years ago in the 90s. And, I'm a believer in longer fasts, shorter fasts, daily fasting. So autophagy happens even in a daily fast, even 15 hours of fasting, you get some of this autophagy. But in studying fasting, one of the criticisms of a longer fast was the immune system gets lower. And they made that judgment by looking at white blood cell drop when you fast. And that's dangerous. Well, it was recently now a scientist named Walter Longo, who I'm blessed to work with his organization, some of that research and sharing that research. But Longo showed that the white blood cells drop dramatically during a fasting state because of autophagy. So, but here's the best part. Clinically, we knew this. The only answer we had back then was, look, all we can tell you is hyperimmunity, autoimmunity, whether it's allergies, food allergies, autoimmune of any type, gets better, and people are left with a better immune system. So I don't know what's happening, why the white blood cells are dropping, but all I can tell you clinically, it works, right? Now, he explained that the autophagy is getting rid of these white blood cells that are overreactive. They're living too long. They're creating inflammation. They're hyperreacting to your food, your environment, right? Autoimmune, attacking itself. So we're fasting, we're getting rid of those cells. And then we're triggering the stem cell reaction, and we're creating new white blood cells that aren't overreactive. So clinically, fasting is a really important part of what I teach my doctors to do and what we do to really regulate the immune system, downregulate inflammation. And when you put that with my cellular detox, it's how we get really sick people well. The magic is at the cell.
Absolutely. Yeah. The work that Longo and his team, I didn't actually realize that you're collaborating with him as well. That's amazing.
Yeah, no, they've been a blessing, and to us. So, yeah.
Yeah. What's amazing about that is it's nothing really new, like you're saying. It's more they're just putting the research behind it to substantiate why it works. And so now we can apply that evidence-based lens to fasting the way we couldn't do that 20 years ago. So really, really cool work coming out of that. Check out Walter Longo's research if you are interested in learning more about that. But we'll dive a little bit more into autophagy here in a second. I wanted to give kind of a weird analogy, but also just highlight the fact that the way autophagy or autophagy works is actually very similar to how population balance happens in nature. So, if you think of a large herd of buffalo, and that buffalo herd has become very, very overgrown, what's going to happen is you're going to have wolves coming in that are going to eat the weak and the young, the ones that are less strong and less robust. And so in our case, it's kind of happening like that on a cellular level. The cells that are weak or damaged or broken, usually indicated by that DNA damage that the rest of the cells, like the macrophages, can read, they end up consuming those cells just like you would be consuming the weak or the young of a buffalo herd, right? So it's interesting how our bodies are very much represented by the laws of nature in that regard when it comes to population control.
Dr. Alex, the problem is who's fasting, right? I mean, meaning that, I said the Huns of people, fasting spring, they realized that was the key to their longevity and their health was fasting spring. I do a 5-day fast 4 times a year, approximately. I do weekly fast, so 2 to 3 times a week, I just eat one meal, or maybe I go to the next day without eating. I just finished a partial fast, like some Longo's work. My wife did the Prolone, which is basically he boxed limited calories in 5 days, and I just did a 500 calorie day, just partial fast. Sometimes I just water fast. So I mix up my fast throughout the year. But to your point, is that's your body cleanses these bad cells, right? It's like, and you de-age, you really do. Fasting, I'll tell you, look, and this is a shameless plug here, but my Beyond Fasting book will be released here. You can go to beyondfastingbook.com and pre-order it. But in the book, I talk about every year my wife and I measure our telomeres. That's the only biological clock known to man, meaning we can actually look at our cellular age versus our actual age. Because I
Right.
was so sick, my cellular age, unfortunately, was far, far older than my actual age. Now I'm far younger at my cellular age,
You're
based
back
on
to where you started. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And I mean, my cellular detox, obviously, and the fasting strategies that I teach, and the diet variation strategies of all really attributed to that cellular decrease in age. My wife is literally somewhere in her 20s, so I'm
Wow.
dating 20-year-old, and so I'm pretty proud of that. No, but she's 51, so she's really her actual age
Wow.
much. I guess
Yeah,
she's
I guess you should clarify that. Yeah, and just for anyone who's listening who doesn't know, the diet that Longo and his team created that you were talking about is called a fasting mimicking diet, and typically that's a 5-day diet that has around 900 calories per day on average. One thing I actually wanted to ask you was, I know Longo typically advocates for about 12 to 14 hours as a daily regular fast. Are you somewhere in that range as well, or do you advocate for a longer fast because of
yeah.
that short-term autophagy?
Yeah, I love Longo. I think he's brilliant. He probably disagrees with me on some things. I disagree with him on some things. I just don't find that science very solid on the 12-hour thing. I can tell you clinically, again, I have a passion for looking at literature and then trying things. And I can tell you that where that would look like it works better is for people who aren't very fat adapted or metabolically flexible, meaning they can use
Mm,
sugar when they have it or fat when they don't have sugar, right? Go back and forth. I think that those people doing longer daily fasts, it doesn't work as well. That's why one of the things I talk about in my book is working up to where you fast a little bit longer every day. When I was in Africa, I watched them. They didn't get up and eat. The men
mm,
got up super early in the morning. They went and they went after prey, and they did not eat until later in the afternoon when they got back. So, I watched a tribe that has very little, if any, disease. They didn't have names for diseases because they didn't exist in the culture. So, I can tell you that I think there's, again, feast famine. There's times to eat. There's a day where I eat 3 meals a day. There's days where I eat one. I think the
mhm.
magic is in the feast famine, not trying to eat every 12 hours in the circadian rhythm. I don't know. I just think when you look at very healthy people, most of us wake up not hungry, because here's why. What happens is, because he says, well, we should eat 12-hour rhythm, which means you eat breakfast in the morning. And again, I think it's appropriate for certain people, but there's something called the dawn effect. When you get up, cortisol rises. It wakes you up, right, with the sun, and you wake up. Well, when cortisol rises, it releases glucose from your
Mhm.
liver, and that gives you energy, which actually cuts your appetite, right? So you're burning your glucose. The last thing a healthy person wants to do is eat, right? Because you're functioning on your glucose that you released, and then later you'll start to get hungry as you burn that glucose down. So that's kind of where I logically disagree with that. But again, I think it's appropriate at certain points, though. So
I love that you didn't take my bait and try to give an answer comparably. Instead, you answered it, in my opinion, beautifully, because I agree that the 12 to 14-hour fast window is kind of a general recommendation that for the general population may kind of work. But if you want to optimize individual health, you have to look at it from a bigger picture again. You can't just say generally, everybody does well on a 12 to 14 or even a 16 and 8 type of fast.
yeah.
Changing it up and going back and forth makes much more of a
Yeah,
difference.
and Alex, think about it. Most studies are done. All studies are done with the general population, of
Yeah.
America who are sugar burners. I promise you, they're going to do better, eating every 12 hours than, skipping a meal where they're going, oh, because you have to
Yeah.
work people up to that, right? I mean, you don't just become like one of the Africans in the tribe. It doesn't work that easy.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you say or explain how people would know that they're in a state of autophagy? How would they know that they're actually getting to that point? Are you just simply indicating that through their keto level, their ketosis level, or is there some other kind of measurement that you would use?
There's a book sitting right over there, Cancer is a Metabolic Disease, by a guy named, brilliant guy, Thomas Seyfried. And
Hmm.
I was blessed to be in a little mastermind with him. And they were talking about, when we were talking about ketosis and fasting people for tumors and cancer, they would watch the tumor shrink when autophagy was at its max. And he has something called the target zone that he developed for that, right? Now, what I did was take what he did, and I said, well, wouldn't that work for the average person? And he was like, yeah, I don't see why it wouldn't. So I kind of took what he discovered with tumors to the average person to target max autophagy. So here's how you do it. I use a keto meter. You have to look at blood, not urine. And it has the ability to look at glucose and ketones. Keto Mojo is the one that I like. But anyways, so you do your morning glucose and ketones and write it down. And you just do this maybe 3 times just to get an average. And then you can do this as your fast goes on, or even as your fast in the day goes on, and redo your glucose and ketones. One of the things you used to see is glucose trending down and ketones trending up is an indicator that you're using fat as energy. But when you're doing a long fast, or even in a ketotic state, you know you're in this max autophagy when you hit what he calls the target range, 1-to-1 ratio, meaning glucose to ketones. Now let me explain, because if you're thinking of the American standard of 80 is your glucose number, you have to take 80 and divide it by 18 to get the European number. Okay, so 80 divided by 18. If your glucose was 70, you take 70 and divide it by 18. Write that down, 4.3. That means your ketones have to reach a level of 4.3, 1-to-1. That means you're entering max autophagy. Now that's an estimate that Tom used when they would see shrinkage of tumors based on autophagy. So I think it's a really good way, and we've used it clinically, and I can tell you it works really well. When we get somebody beyond that 1-to-1 ratio, then we know we're just crushing bad cells. That doesn't mean you're not getting autophagy before that point. Just that max autophagy that we know really clinically makes a difference. We target that 1-to-1 ratio.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Getting to a range of 4.3 or 4.5 for ketones is actually, that's fairly high from a keto stage for the average person, right?
Yeah, and to your point, it shows you that when we look at studies on the 1-to-1 ratio, this target max autophagy, or we look at studies on benefits of therapeutic ketones, they're really at those higher levels. You don't typically see that when you're in a state of ketosis. You typically see that in states of fasting, right? I mean, with that 1-to-1 ratio, you're going to hit that either in a partial fast, a pure water fast, some type of caloric depletion, protein depletion. And by the way, another important point with autophagy, if your protein on average is above 20 grams, you're going to knock yourself out of autophagy. So you have to keep your protein low as well as calories. But the point is that we to hit those big numbers, we have to be in some form of fasting. It's another argument why we need periodic fasts.
Yeah, because people who are regularly going into a keto state are often bragging about ketone levels at 3. And that's not going to get you there, obviously. And so that's a really great point that I'm guessing a lot of people.
I think another thing that Tom talks about in his book, and others, but we're talking about Tom Seyfried, is that you don't benefit from the high ketones, the elevated ketones, if you have elevated glucose. Your body won't use the ketones. Your brain won't use the ketones, which helps heal the brain and the cells. It'll use the glucose. We want to see glucose dropping and ketones rising. So one of the things, even when we pick someone, we talked a little bit about that fasting window, daily, intermittent fasting daily, and how to pick an eating window or a fasting window. We look at morning glucose and ketones, and then we do it right before first meal. We want to see glucose dropping and ketones rising as a marker that your mitochondria are doing the right thing. If it's not, then we have to change things. And by the way, very toxic people, Alex, they don't do the right thing, right? So it takes a level of cellular detox to get their cells even using fat to get the ketones and this autophagy going, because they're going, I don't know why in ketosis I don't lose weight, or my ketones don't go up, or they can't fat adapt. Toxic people, that's a problem. That's a whole other subject, but I talk about all that in my book.
Awesome. No, I'm so glad that you're saying that, because you're right. We could go on this topic for another hour, and there's other stuff that we want to cover. So I'm glad that you mentioned that it's in your book, because for anyone who wants to dive into this any deeper, they can definitely jump right into that as well. So let's change gears a little bit. We're going to talk more now about aging, and you touched on the telomeres before. What I want to talk about is going back to where we started with regards to hormones, and maybe just kind of give us a bit of a walkthrough around what actually happens as we age with regards to hormones, and what can we do along the way to optimize that and keep things in balance as long as possible.
When they look at people that are aging very well in some of these, ancient cultures, because I remember a study of, I think it was someplace, in Tibet, and there was another one was part of the Okinawa study, but they didn't have extremely high hormone levels. Actually, we would argue today that their hormone levels of things like testosterone, you know, hormones that we would want elevated, weren't very elevated, but their cells were very sensitive to the hormones.
Right.
And we know as you age, your cells should in fact become more sensitive to the hormones, and therefore, keep you in a very relatively healthy state. It helps you hold on to your muscle longer, which is key for your joints. Look, when we age, there's two factors, right? Our brain, keeping our brains healthy, because when that goes, forget it, and that's what's going in people today, and our joints. So it's like this hormone optimization is a big factor. So we need to keep our cells very sensitive to the hormones as we age, I think more importantly. And that does keep our joints healthy. That does keep our brain healthy. The very two things that are the key to aging well. So all these strategies that we're talking about, removing toxins at the cell, keeping those hormone receptors free, these fasting strategies, diet variation strategies, this is what you do. This isn't rocket science here, but again, I say that, but there's some strategies, that are different, because when people think of detox out there, they think of the colon cleanse, the liver cleanse, a far infrared sauna. I'm not against any of those things. Matter of fact, I think they're all appropriate. But true detox has to happen at the cell if you're going to optimize hormones.
And again, I love that you didn't take the bait, because I was trying to fish for other things that you can do specifically in that regard, when you're trying to optimize hormones going through aging, but you keep bringing it back to these simplistic types of interventions, which are thousands of years old, that work. You're right. And there's a reason why these cultures apply these for so long, so consistently. You touched on it before, but I just want to make sure we're not missing any details with regards to when we're dealing with weight loss plateaus. So people are trying to lose weight, they are sticking to a diet consistently. We've covered the fact that staying on something for too long is going to affect your hormones and keep things in a non-feast and famine type state. But is there anything else you want to kind of explain with regards to how to avoid those plateaus when trying to lose weight?
Well, let me give someone a really good place to start. I think a nugget that you can hold on to right from this lecture here. I start with my 5-1-1. That means you can do 5 days of any diet that you're on, for that matter, but maybe it's 5 days of ketosis, low carb, or 5 days of whatever diet you're presently on. And then you add 1 day of a fast, just like we would in an ancient culture, right? 1 day where either you eat just one meal, or you eat maybe a low calorie meal, 500 calories, right? Or you don't eat it all until the next day. You choose how that day looks. I never plan that day, Alex, meaning that it's just always my busy days. And I go, okay, I'm busy. It's like, okay, well, here it is, 5:30. Okay, there goes that, right? I didn't even realize I didn't eat. So those days, I call that metabolic mitochondrial fitness, meaning bad cells don't adapt. So when you're going without food, every time you do that, your mitochondria, where you burn fat, right, and make energy, they get more and more fit, right? So in my PowerPoints, I have a little guy that's all fit there, mitochondria that's all fit, because you only get fit if you get stressed, right? Or you stress the muscle. So what going without food 1 or 2 days a week is how you stress the mitochondria. Make them work, and the bad ones don't adapt. Oh, and the good ones, they get stronger and they get more efficient fat burners. That's how you break through weight loss resistance. And then on Saturday, make that your feast day. Add a healthy carbs in. That's the day you eat more fruit, you eat more potatoes, knock yourself out, right? Some people do better with 2 feast days a week. So maybe it looks like 3, 2, 2. where they're doing 3 days of a regular diet. Maybe you're intermittent fasting on those 3 days, right? Eating in a certain window. And then they do 2 feast days and 2 famine days. But the change is how you break through weight loss resistance. And that is a nugget. I expand on that obviously in my book Beyond Fasting, but that's a nugget you can take away right now.
Yeah, that's, I think, the key message here. One of the key messages is that constant feast and famine state and just going back and forth. Awesome. Okay, let's then talk a little bit about detox, because obviously that's a big component of everything you do as well. I want to understand, first of all, why do we need to detox, aside from the obvious? But can we go through some of the key points on what people should look for, and specifically how practitioners can explain to their patients why they need to detox?
Yeah, I think I'm best known for my work on my detox, my cellular detox, and I even have a more simplified boxed version of what we call true cellular detox, which
Hmm.
takes people through a prep phase, body phase, and the most important phase, the brain phase. And that's how I got my life back and thousands of others. But, look, today it's impossible to function hormonally healthy, period, if you don't detox. Uh, you know, I think it's not even necessary, I think, to go through the fact that, we're exposed to what, 518 chemicals on average just starting our day with personal care products, right? 216 are cancer causers, and, glyphosate sprayed on all of our food supply, which causes leaky gut, leaky brain, which Stephanie Seneff showed that one chemical that we're all being exposed to, even in rainfall, is
Yeah.
creating leaky brain, creating heavy metals that we're already have stored in our tissues from utero to cross deeper into our brain. That's how I got sick, man, right? It's like, not to mention hidden infections from root canals, cavitations. These things are unknowingly making people sick. If y'all haven't watched the movie Root Cause, go to Root Cause the movie and you can watch it for free, rootcausethemovie.com. These hidden toxins that every one of them, if you have wisdom teeth removed, 88% chance you have a cavitation, which is a hidden infection in your jaw that will disrupt your immune system. I've watched people walk out of a dental chair getting one of those fixed, 21 years of pain, walking away from 21 years of pain. That's a true story. I interviewed them on my Facebook. But I've watched that happen again and again with chronic pain, different hormonal conditions. People break through weight loss resistance by getting infection out of their mouth or getting rid of a moldy situation in their home. How many people have mold in their home don't know it because you don't see it, right? A wet basement, or you had a water leak, develops mold. Mold is a nasty biotoxin that disrupts the pituitary, that controls our hormones, creates weight loss resistance. So do we need to detox? Everybody to some level needs to detox. Listen, I got my life back from my cellular detox. However, I still do what I call my brain phase, where it's you get the toxins out of your brain one time a month. I still do it. Now, last year I probably did 6 of those. This year my New Year's resolution was I'm doing one a month. Not because I have symptoms, just because I know it's the key to hormone health. I know it's the key to living life long healthy. Your brain, your joints, toxins are the inflammation driver and the life disruptor. Everybody needs a detox, but you have to do it right.
So you touched on brain phase. So you're doing this on a regular basis. What exactly is that? How does that work?
So my detox that I teach, there's a preparatory phase where
Okay.
you have to get the cell doing what it naturally does, and that's get rid of toxins. That's why when I say detox really occurs at the cell. This is a great looking cell right here. So this is where detox is. That's the mic cover, but it makes for a good cell today. This is where the detox has to happen. This is how you hormonally get your life back. This is how you feel good. This is where you make energy, the cell. So a colon cleanse, a liver cleanse, these types of things, it doesn't fix this. This is normally set up to get rid of toxins. When you make energy in your cell, you make toxins that your body has to get rid of. When these pathways in the cell get shut down, now you start to accumulate even the toxins that the cell makes when it makes energy in there. It's like burning wood in a fireplace. If you didn't have the damper open, House fills with smoke, you die.
Mm,
That's
exactly.
happening is toxins accumulate in the cell. They don't get out and they start filling the cell, and then your energy's down. You get more and more toxic, age faster. But the point is this that I want you to take away is the prep phase gets the cell just starting these pathways going. We open up downstream pathways, the liver, the kidneys, the gut. Very important to prep the body before you
Mm,
start detox. Then there's a body phase where we're just trying to get the easy to get toxins to set up a concentration so we can move things from the deeper tissues like your brain to lower concentration, because things move from higher to lower concentration. That's the way toxins move. So the body phase, we're in it for a month or two just to clear, to set up that concentration gradient. The most important phase of all that you asked about is the brain phase. That's when we add fat soluble chelators in to go deeper into the fat stores. Your brain is mostly fat. Your cells are fat. Your nerves are fat. So we go into those fatty membranes where the toxins are stored. And that's the brain phase. I did it for 4 years, and every year I got healthier and healthier. So myself and my doctors, we teach people that process, and
mm.
it works. It is.
Yeah, I love that analogy with the damper on a stove or on a fireplace as well, because if you don't have the downstream channels open and you start to do a brain phase type of detox, you can run into some major issues. Can you maybe just touch on what do you use when you're using the brain phase, specifically in terms of ingredients or
Yeah,
substances?
absolutely. There's a product that we created over the years. It's called Cyto Detox. It
Hmm.
has very small particles that have the ability to go into the cell and these membranes, but it has
Hmm.
bigger particles that stay out. And the reason that is when we start getting the cell detoxing, it'll release toxins. We need those bigger particles out here is to catch the toxins so you don't redistribute, because many of them will make their way into the brain and create more problems, right?
Yeah.
So we have particles that go in, particles that act as a vehicle to make sure that everything moves completely out of the body. And then we use a fat soluble chelator called alpha lipoic acid in an S form that has the ability to cross into the brain, into the fatty membrane. Now, cytodetox has some particles that cross into the brain, but the ALA, the alpha lipoic acid, crosses deeper, because things like mercury, it turns to inorganic mercury and it's locked in your brain
Hmm.
forever. So if you've had fillings in your mouth, even if you had them removed, that mercury vapor comes off the fillings, crosses the blood-brain barrier, and it turns to inorganic mercury. It's locked. So we need that fat soluble to get it, grab it, but it doesn't do a great job of moving it all the way out of the body. And that's where that cytodetox comes in and helps it and grabs it and moves it out of the body. We use another binder in the gut that doesn't leave the gut. It acts as a catcher's mitt, so you don't
Hmm.
auto intoxicate from your gut. It happens. So here's what happens. So when the toxins start moving out of the brain, out of the cells, a lot of them make their way to the liver. So here's your liver. The liver has bile. It's a fatty substance that we need for digestion. The toxins bind in it, and it's called hepatic biliary sludge, meaning toxic liver sludge, liver and bile
Yeah.
sludge. But anyways, when you're digesting fat, it dumps the bile, but it brings the toxins with it. Here's the problem. Your body's designed to reabsorb the bile back to the liver from the intestines. So what does it do? It auto-intoxicate. So
Yeah.
I learned the process years ago. We use a binder that has 4 different types of binders in it, purposely, because there's so many different types of toxins that do better with certain binders than others. It sits in the gut like a catcher's mitt. So when you dump the bile, it grabs it and pulls it out. Otherwise, you just auto intoxicate. So we're using binders at the cell to make sure that they get down that far. Then we're using a binder in the gut, and we're using a binder that has the ability to cross into the brain. I mean, all that has been 20 years I've been teaching that process. And it,
Hmm.
like I said, I mean, it got my life back, but very sick and challenged people from all around the world. That's real detox, man. That's where my passion just flows.
Yeah, again, I love the overall picture they just painted. I'll give you a quick sad example of a patient that I dealt with. Young guy, 20 years old, was on the way to the Olympics for paddling and ended up developing a real issue with biliary sludge to the point where he had his gallbladder removed and his
Yeah.
entire digestion changed, and he no longer was at the same level anymore. He was set back 2 years in training, and couldn't get back. And by the time he ended up seeing me, he was already so far gone that we had to start basically from scratch and build him back up. But all of that could have been avoided had he been applying these kinds of principles right from the get-go. Right?
People do things like coffee enemas, and that pushes that bile out, and it's helpful. But if you don't do it with a binder in the gut, you're creating a lot of autointoxication. And if you don't upregulate cell function, ultimately, you're not really, again, real detox has to be at the cell, and that's the point. But those things help, though. I mean, coffee enemas, I'm a fan when you use it within this system I'm describing. Even colon cleanses are helpful because you have to keep your bowels moving, right? But in and itself, it's only temporary. And that gentleman, what happens in most of those situations is, they get their gallbladder removed or they end up on antacids, right? They just chase symptoms for years and then they end up with their gallbladder removed, right? Oh, that helps for a little bit. Then they end up with another complicating factor because their liver is ultimately toxic, right? And then they do things to deal with those symptoms. They end up on medications and they end up with high cholesterol and medications for that. And you see the pattern. You get thrown right off the back of the treadmill because you never got to the real problem, a toxic cell.
You mentioned ALA as being the agent that can cross the barrier of the cell. Are you able to share what the substance is that you use as the binder in the digestive tract?
Yeah, so in it, there's a special carbon that comes from Holland. It's a clean carbon, and it's so, not every carbon can bind this complex. Matter of fact, there's only one, a study showed, it's this one. When you throw it in the air, it goes to the walls. That's how activated this carbon is. The problem with carbons like this is they're contaminated. Matter of fact, most carbons, even the cheap ones, are contaminated. They hold lead, arsenic, and other pesticides. So we test every batch that comes in, and this is a pharmacy-grade carbon. There's other different things like humates and fulvates that are great binders, but they're also toxic. Matter of fact, we couldn't find a clean source of those binders. And finally we did, but we still end up having to send a lot of batches back because even in processing, they grab toxins. Things like zeolites are amazing binders, but again, they're contaminated, right? And that's what's in cytodetox, at least part of what's in cytodetox. But again, it's you have to make sure they're clean, and that becomes a real problem.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's again, fantastic point, because when you're dealing with just common activated charcoal or other types of similar products, you don't know exactly what's in them or how they're manufactured. So you have to be very certain of that.
Another binder, when I was in Africa, we were eating these things from a tree called a baobab tree. Gorgeous, huge tree with these big fruit like this on it, right?
Yeah.
But you crack it open because it's a hard shell, and then there's these little seeds that have this white powder around them, right? And we were just doing what the Africans were doing. They would suck on this and they would make porridges out of this stuff. And they claimed all these health benefits from it. Yeah, it's high in vitamin C and other antioxidants, but we learned that it was the most incredible binder. And so a scientist that was developing this bind product for the gut, he said, man, I found this amazing binder, and and he went on, binds biotoxins as well as heavy metals. And he told me what it was from. Like, oh my gosh, I tried to import that product and failed years ago. And it was a product that I learned about in Africa. And, my buddy and I were just eating this stuff and felt amazing. So that's also in the product.
Phenomenal. Oh, that's actually in the product as well. Oh, great.
Yeah, it's in the product. It's in bind product.
Yeah.
He did. So that it was like this full circle thing from me being in Africa, trying to import it, didn't. He actually found it, imported it years later, and it's in bind as one of the binders.
Fascinating. Just another great example again of indigenous cultures and how much wisdom there was there over time. And now we're able to plug the research into it and explain why they actually did certain things or why they worked. Yeah. Wow, that's amazing. So you summed up your true cellular detox program by talking about those 3 phases. Is there anything else that you want to share about the program overall?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things in the program, I learned this when I went virtual. I teach doctors now, but I don't have a brick and mortar practice anymore. But I coach. I have to call it coaching, and it is coaching. People from all over the world. I do it virtually on Skype, etc. And one of the things I learned is that I had to teach people this process of cellular detox and healing. And that way they would do it long enough to actually matter. And so going virtual, I had to teach. I couldn't rely on people coming to my office anymore. I realized it was a pitfall anyway, because the moment they stopped coming to the office, the moment they stopped detoxing. So the very few people were doing it long enough to actually get their life back permanently or lasting. So when I went virtual, my goal now is to teach them what I teach my doctors and literally educate them. So True Cellular Detox is also a portal that I had built out to educate people in the process, because the power is knowing how to do this so you can do it the rest of your life. I said, I'm never going to not do this. And this is something I'm going to do my whole life. We can't avoid toxins, even the clean life that I live. So it's something I got my life back, but I know it's something that will keep me aging well, into my, listen, I don't want to live to 100 if I have to live it unhealthy,
Absolutely.
So triple digits only if it's disease free, only.
So just to be clear for people who are listening, if you have practitioners who want to learn more about this, you actually offer training and programs for practitioners to work with you to learn how to apply these principles in their practice.
Yeah, and my next seminar is in California, Newport Beach, November 14th through the 17th. And that is, if you go to hcfseminars.com, it stands for Health Centers of the Future, hcfseminars.com, you can find out more about that if you're a practitioner.
Perfect. We'll put those in the show notes as well so that everyone can see that. Do you offer virtual training for practitioners as well?
We're starting, we're starting to do that. But, when the doctors join our program, there is a whole component of virtual training. Our doctors are from all over, so.
Awesome. Okay. Well, look, we're going to have to wrap up. And unfortunately, I could probably talk to you for another hour at least, and probably an hour per topic going forward. So we'll probably have to bring you back on and start to do deeper dives on fasting and detoxing specifically. But before we go, a couple last questions. First of all, the picture behind you. We touched on this before we started, but that's your family. You have 5 children, 2 of which are adopted, but you have a pretty powerful story in there as well. So can you maybe share that quickly to our listeners?
Yeah, they're a lot older than that now. Yeah. When I was sick, actually, these guys right here on the end, that one and that one were babies. And it was horrible because I couldn't even handle them crying. My wife would have to take them and literally leave the house. Now, this little guy right here in between, he was, when I started getting my life back, we had him. He was 6 weeks old at the time, and we had a tragedy in our family. These 2 lost their parents tragically, and we ended up with them at age 7, and that was shortly right after that. Dylan, right here, you can tell, actually, I have a closer picture of this, I'll show you. You can tell he was on the autism spectrum, Asperger's sensory integration. You can tell he wasn't right here. They're twins. And he was vaccine damaged. With each round of vaccines, he kept getting worse until he went over the edge. Dylan will be here probably momentarily. He works for my company now, 22 years old. You'd never know it. He has his own business as well. So that's the victory. What I learned to get myself well, I always like to say Dylan was my second patient. But and then Olivia, his twin, she avoided the autism spectrum like many girls do. But as a teenager, she ended up with fibromyalgia, very sensitive to pain, sound, and she also went through cellular detox. All 7 of us did, because my wife had severe lead toxicity, which disrupted her hormones. Went into my boys. The #1 cause of lead toxicity is mom, and they had major gut issues. I'm telling you, from pain to purpose, all 7 of us. But Olivia now is in her 2nd quarter of chiropractic school, becoming a practitioner. Wow. Yeah. And Dylan's working for the business. So anyways, pain to purpose has been that whole group's story. So we went through a lot. We went through court battles when we adopted these guys, and it was horrific, but worked out. They're amazing kids now.
No, and I love the fact that you have them in the background there. That's really special. Well, look, Dr. Pompa, thank you so much for your time. For people who want more information, where do they go? How do they find you? What's the best way to engage with you?
Yeah, my website, DR, like doctor, DR, and then my last name, pompa.com. So drpompa.com. I do a podcast, as you know, Cellular Healing Team. I have thousands of articles. And again, you can get my new book, Beyond Fasting, at beyondfastingbook.com and pre-order it. But go to my website, tons of stuff there.
Awesome. Everything's on the website. I definitely encourage people to check out your podcast as well, because you have, I think you're on episode, 260 by now? Somewhere
70,
like that? So,
yeah, 279.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Wow. So you've got a lot of episodes on there with some amazing guests, tons of incredible information. We'll be keeping an eye out for Beyond Fasting. Super excited for that book to come out. It's been a real pleasure. We've really enjoyed having you here. I can't wait for the next one, because we're going to be able to dive a bit deeper on everything we've talked about. But for now, we'll have to leave it at that and bid you adieu. Thank you to everyone who is listening. I'm Dr. Alex Keller, and we'll see you next time.